This was a Continental Chess Tour event with a guaranteed prize fund in roughly April of 2000. I'd won my first 4 games in a row in the 2-day schedule, basically. And my 5th game of the day, I figure I'm playing someone else who's 4-0. And obviously this is going to be a massive gargantuan task for me to overcome my opponent because they're 4-0, so I basically had the black pieces. And I settled in, resolving to myself that I was going to be determined not to lose this game to secure my lead, or at least my tie for first with him, with that 4.5 points. And my opponent opens with 1 e4, signaling his intentions for a very, very, very aggressive fight. Now, I have played the Caro-Kann's defense, the French defense. I've answered e4 with e5. I mainly play the Sicilian defense, but I also play the Caro-Kann defense, which is what I chose for this particular event. Just because the prize money is guaranteed and I wanted to play a solid, good game of chess regardless of the tactics my opponent could cook up. And after d4, d5, my opponent immediately goes into the Panov Attack, which I consider the absolute best variation against the Caro-Kann. Basically, it gives you the richest choice of plans as white and for black. It gives you a certain initiative. And this morning, for example, now I always play knight f6, knight c3, and after knight c6 we reach the main line, where white has a choice between going into an endgame after bishop to g4, or white has a choice of avoiding the tedious endgame with the move bishop to g5. That is, undermining the d5 square. And this was the choice of Botvinnik himself when he was playing a very short miniature against Rudolf Spielmann, who went off the rails with queen to b6, from what I remember. And Rudolf Spielmann eventually got his queen trapped after capturing on b2. And it was a miniature played by Botvinnik against Rudolf Spielmann around 1938. I'm just going to guess. And Botvinnik basically put the whole Caro-Kann under a cloud with the help of the Panov Attack, which afterwards it became known as the Panov-Botvinnik Attack. So for about 10 years, the Caro-Kann waned massively in popularity as people struggled to deal with this direct assault on the Caro. Now this morning, someone played the rather lackadaisical move knight to c6 against me, and I thought it was actually quite awkward for black because there are very few chances for black to win. I chose c takes d5, which is not the most popular move. Knight to c3 transposing to the main line is the most popular move. But if you're going to punish your opponent for playing a certain line, then this would easily be the line. Now we have a line of the c3 Sicilian, where white has played c3 against the Sicilian, c takes d4 very prematurely. And the ultimate trap in this particular position here, after, let's say, bishop e2 I chose this morning, and this is a very common tactic to fall for with check, removing the defender of the queen. And it has happened to many from a variety of positions and a variety of openings that this bishop on f3 captures the knight on c6 with check, and the queen on d4 is in the lurch. So for the most part, this morning my opponent did not fall for this, and immediately went into knight f6. And already there is a major problem with this particular position after queen a5. Now I chose d5, which was immediately going to test black's wherewithal. Now there are a lot of different ways. I could play queen to b3, tagging the b7 pawn. I could alleviate the pressure on the dark squares, but I chose immediately d5, and my opponent did not find the best response at all, which is rook to d8. Instead, after knight to b4, they found themselves in a little bit of a lurch here after bishop to b5 check, bishop d7, bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, and after castles, black is clearly worse, if not strategically lost. Very difficult to get this bishop out, and therefore, when black is fighting for the center, as he does in the terrace defense, you might consider this a reverse terrace defense where I'm playing white. We'll play knight f3, sorry, knight f6 in this particular case. And after knight c3, we still have to be concerned about this. Very popular is g6, treating the position in true terrace fashion by going after the isolated d4 pawn. However, in my game here, remember, flashing back to the year 2000, I had just been laid off from a programming job where I was debugging code for the Y2K crisis, if anybody remembers those days. And I was glad to take a very large check to be laid off in a way, but I missed my friends and my work environment dearly. I was still teaching and coaching chess and after-school programs, and had private students as well at the time. But when my opponent played bishop to e3, now the alarm bells started going off. No longer was I really concerned about being 4-0 in this tournament. My concern here as black was, how can I win this game in 30 moves or less? That is my first and foremost goal, by the way, when I play. And I model myself a lot on Caro-Kann when he was at his heyday around the 1930s, 1931, where he literally ripped through every strong player of the day. And he did so in very Morphy-like fashion to a certain extent, slicing and dicing his way. So I'm already trying to think, how can I punish my opponent? So since my opponent had played this very passive move, and this is, as I just mentioned, a terrace defense in reverse with these two pawns attacking my center. We've already played c takes d5 and e takes d5. Pardon my reversal of the notation, but now all that's left for me is to play the sixth move, g3, i.e., in this case, g6. Now my opponent does perhaps the right thing, but they're a move down on this entire theory of a line, and if they are going to continue, they also have the Dubov terrace type idea with bishop c4 that could well be the best. Certainly developing a knight to the best possible square could be the best. But they chose actually queen to b3, which I thought was rather unusual since the b7 point was not yet a weakness. This gives me so much leeway. First things first, we're going to cripple the pawn structure in the center. And then we're going to pinpoint the e3 pawn as a weakness. Now, remember, I'm 4-0 in a 7-round tournament. In a two-day schedule, I played 4 game 35s, I think, in order to merge in this particular round with the slow schedule. And my opponent was ricocheting his moves off like he was still in the fast schedule. So, all in all, I was pretty happy about this. Now, my opponent really does have to suck it up and play bishop king to f2 in this position. Or perhaps just even give up the pawn and to start developing his pieces as rapidly as possible and trying to take advantage of his space. Because he does have a space advantage. He does have a bit of space staked out here. But instead he plays this rather unusual move, knight to d1, which overly protects e3. I'll give him some credit for the fact that he may or may not have been showing me a certain amount of respect. But all I really need to do in this position is get my pieces out and get my king safe. This is the first order of business for every strong player. Now, interestingly enough, let's fix our timer here, as I did plan on Q&A for some of these moves. Now, interestingly enough, without Twitch working and without Twitch audience, and having this only be a YouTube video, I'm a little less concerned about the Q&A with the 2-minute timer, even though it's there for the record. So in this particular case, I would like to bring to your attention that white should continue developing his pieces. Now, I have a variety of choices here. I could go for the Rudolf Spielmann-Botvinnik plan of trying to trap my opponent's queen. For example, after bishop to e6, queen takes b7. My first inclination to play knight a5 doesn't quite work out, but we can start to intimidate our opponent along the white squares in the center and threaten to play rook to b8. After all, the knight is the only piece in the mix that's hanging. And after a move like queen to b5, rook to b8, white would have a hard time with his king as I just rip open the center and prepare to play rook to e8. The b2 pawn, by the way, is not hanging because of the knight. So that was never really the intention with rook to b8. It's mainly to gain time on the queen. Perhaps tempo the queen again, as after d takes e5, rook to b4, the queen has to find a new home. And it looks as though there might even be a tactic in this position in my favor already, with bishop takes e3. The queen cannot capture because of rook to e4. And if the knight captures, then we're simply going to rip to shreds our opponent's king side and bring in another queen, bring in another rook. And I don't think white can survive this. This should be a whirlwind attack that I'm certain that no one in their right mind should ever want to be playing with white. The details of which are irrelevant. Needless to say, I played a rather unusual move in this position. Instead of bishop e6, I played queen a5 check, and I had a very specific idea in mind when my opponent played queen to c3, and that was to take advantage of the pin with knight to c2 check, trade queens, and be up material with better pawn structure. My opponent has 3 pawn islands. And by pawn islands, I mean that he has 3 groupings of 2 pawns each, whereas I have a slightly better endgame with 1 group of 4 and a group of 2. In the endgame, basically, this means that fewer pawns will need to be protected by pieces, given that the base of the pawns, the pawn base, will be guarded by perhaps a piece or the king, and the opponent whoever has more weaknesses to attack, basically, i.e. more pawn islands, then more pieces will be tied down to the defense. So once again, I am on the initiative. My opponent finally finds the move king to f2, which he should have found instead of knight to d1, and I have to choose how to go about removing the defender some more. So we eyeball not just the king on f2, but the pawn on f2, the pawn on b2, and we threaten to bring our knight back to the center with pressure on this pawn. And my opponent chooses bishop c4. Objectively, it is the best move, but all I have to do now is start seizing the white squares in the center as well. By bringing a rook to this square, everything seems to be falling. Now, my opponent's desire to get his king safe, perfectly acceptable at this point, obviously. He could have tried to simplify the position and gain time on my knight by playing a3, and if knight c2, rook c1. And I may have a little bit of a tricky time trying to decide how to extract my knight from that little abyss that he's found himself in. Instead, as it turns out, my opponent just plays the natural move, and as we already know, natural moves can lead to natural disasters. you really want to strive to seek out superhuman moves, super ideas for the most part. And after the move rook on A to D8, I'm sorry, A to C8, we already are pinpointing this pawn. We're threatening all sorts of stuff on our opponent's bishop and our rook, which has now become a target. And he plays, once again, I mean, not really the natural move. If he had played the natural move, I would have bishop to D3, winning a piece or the exchange in this particular case. He can still just guard his bishop and give up the rook. But he finds an even more dynamic move. Knight to E5. Now this does not necessarily solve the problem that he has of getting his king safe, but he has covered the square D3 from this idea. Well, it is time to reposition our pieces and attack his best placed piece. With our worst placed piece, the bishop on A6 was not necessarily doing anything. And at long last, he finally tucks his king away. His rooks are, ironically, are no longer are still not connected because of the knight. And this is like a slam dunk for winning the game in 30 moves or less. So here it's basically move number 18 when I'm winning a piece or the exchange. My opponent finds rook to F4, which tries to hang on. However, the exchange is still falling. It is not directly falling, you might think, but there is also the possibility of taking advantage of the pin on the long diagonal. Notice how all of black's pieces are coordinated. Now he chose to attack my knight, instead of trying to perhaps simplify his life a little bit more with a move like queen to B3 or walk into the pin with queen to C2. Queen E4 was what I distinctly remember analyzing at the time, trying to decide what I was going to do about that. And we had yet another pinning possibility with a double attack on queen to E4, because I'm also threatening all sorts of checkmates. So basically, he can't just play this way, as much as I would love to play as much as I would love to just play knight e2 and win more material. I was more primed for the threat of mate in 1 in this manner. Did I have it with bishop F1? I did. He didn't have rook to C1 because the same tactic works as well here. Removing the defender and mating. So in general, I remember thinking about these possibilities. I distinctly remember thinking I was going to take on C4, and only now when I have a position in the board in front of me do I realize that I would have more than likely seen queen to E1 straight away. But I was into the too much Batman approach at the time. Needless to say, my opponent plays a totally unexpected move. I did not analyze this move at all. And I had a tough time deciding on how best to take advantage of this situation. Now, knowing that the bishop is hanging, and knowing that I want to get both rooks into the game, objectively I chose knight to E6 to consolidate. After all, I am up in exchange. I have the recommended 2-pawn islands versus the 3-pawn islands, with my opponent having doubled isolated E-pawns. And in a vain effort to activate his pieces and get his rook active, now I have a plethora of choices. I can capture a pawn with check, or I can skewer through. In this particular example, I can skewer through these pieces by capturing on B2, which is what I chose. My opponent objectively has no time for defense and has to play actively to try to get its exchange back. However, the queen being overworked allows rook takes C4. This was the key part of the moment of rook to queen takes B2 that I distinctly remember. So he saves his knight from a loose square. I imagine that he thought he might have had checkmate, but I can just simply retreat. and he chooses to attack my queen. This doesn't work. I get a nice double attack on the queen. The queen attacks e7 and e3. The Desperados' knight attempts to obtain some counterplay by grabbing pawns and attacking mine. And after 28 moves with queen takes e5, my opponent decided to hang it up, since I was the only other person at 4-0, and then I went on to be the only person at 5-0, the only other person besides him at 4-0. And having dusted this game by, basically I was at 5-0, and as it turns out, I discovered when the smoke cleared after a late dinner, I was actually a full point ahead of the field, and then on the remaining day, I only needed to draw the 2 of my remaining games. The 6th round game, a titanic struggle against Perpetual chess podcaster Ben Johnson, took place on Sunday morning, the morning after this. I'm going to give his podcast a plug. He has had me on his show for bonus podcast number 3 for the Dubai match. So I will analyze that game next.